Good day, and thank you for joining me. This will be the first of many videos I will put together to help individuals learn what they need to know to make informed decisions regarding Japanese natural stones. When it comes to these stones, also known as JNAT or JNATs, there can be a lot to learn. It can be very intimidating to enter the hobby and understand what you're looking at, let alone which stones are right for you, your use, and the money that you have to spend. First, let's start with what is Japanese natural stone. These are naturally created sedimentary rocks suitable for blade sharpening formed over the last 250 million years. They're made of deposits such as volcanic ash and the remains of marine plankton life accumulated on the deep seabed or ancient valleys of Japan. Geothermal changes over those millions of years due to tectonic plate shifts resulted in a variety of pressures and heats being applied to this sedimentary buildup, which in turn created the stones that we use today. Compared to the rest of the world, Japan is home to some of the most abundantly accessible formations of natural stone suitable for making Whetstones. A large majority of these veins are located in and around the Kyoto area as well as adjoining prefectures. Japanese natural stones, also known as tenin toishi, range from very soft to very hard, and very coarse to very fine. Often, the harder the stone, the finer it is, but this is not a definitive rule. The combination of these properties result in different benefits and use cases, allowing for a large amount of experimentation from stone to stone. One will usually move from a very coarse and soft stone through a progression of medium-range stones and onto finishing stones, which are usually very hard and fine. This is what we call a stone progression, and is the most traditional approach to using Japanese natural stones. There's a lot to say regarding the grading, designation, and origin of each Japanese natural stone, which I will cover later in the video. It is first important to overview the different type of stone progressions so, as you digest the more complex material in this video, you know what type of progression you are most interested in pursuing, and generally how to use natural stones as a whole. Whether you use a stone or a different type of progression, the first topic we should cover is what we call slurry. Slurry is the combination of water and abrasive stone material mixed together, which sits on top of the sharpening stone itself. As you move the blade across the surface of the stone, this slurry swirls and churns around, assisting in the cutting of the material at the blade's edge. This slurry can be made very thick like mud, thinner like milk, very thin like foggy water, or you can forego making the slurry altogether and instead just use water on the surface of the stone. As this slurry becomes thicker, the effective cutting ability of the stone essentially goes down, while the polishing ability of the stone goes up. In essence, it slows the cutting speed the lighter the slurry is. Altering this thickness and the amount of slurry on the stone itself, we commonly call slurry management. Through slurry management, you can make one stone act in a variety of different ways by controlling the amount of abrasive substance on top of the stone itself and within the mixture. Let's go ahead and take a look at a sharpening session that moves through the different forms of slurry, starting at the coarsest and ending on the finest form of it. There are essentially 3 different ways we can generate this slurry. The first is, should the stone be suitable enough, simply rubbing the blade on the stone's surface, which will pull up particles from the stone and mix it into the initial water you've placed on the surface to begin sharpening. We oftentimes will call this a self-slurrying stone. However, this characteristic is only found in softer stones, which by and large is not the common type of stone within Japanese natural stones. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at a sharpening session with a self-slurrying stone. Oftentimes, even these self-slurrying stones can benefit from raising a slurry with something that's not your knife's edge. So the 2 additional methods to create slurry may be of benefit even if you find yourself with a self-slurrying Japanese natural stone. These other 2 methods follow the same general principle for raising slurry from the stone. However, rather than using the blade's edge, you're going to use a third object. The difference between these 2 other formats is what of those other objects you choose to use. Probably the most popular and modern method of doing this is what we call a diamond plate or a diamond Nagura. This is a brick of aluminum with diamond grit adhered to the surface of it, which falls within the range of 140 to 1200 grit depending on which one you get. When you pick the appropriate grit and apply it to the appropriate stone, this will generate slurry off the surface of the stone and add nothing from the diamond plate itself. This is a favored method of generating slurry because it is a very reliable method and generates what we would usually refer to as pure slurry, or slurry from just the origin Whetstone itself. There's no other type of slurry being added to change the characteristics of the sharpening. We will briefly revisit a clip we just saw to demonstrate a diamond Nagura. The third method is very similar to the diamond plate method where we're rubbing an object on the top of our Whetstone itself. However, this time we would use what's called a natural stone Nagura. This term Nagura translates essentially to correcting stone or rubbing stone in Japanese, and it is usually a smaller, palm-sized or finger-sized stone you rub on the surface of your primary Whetstone to generate the slurry. Should this Nagura be cut off of the same mother block your original natural Whetstone was sourced from, we would usually call that a Tomo Nagura, or partner stone. In most circumstances for Japanese natural stones, you will not have the ability to source a true Tomo Nagura unless it's sold with it, and often you will hear the term Tomo Nagura used in reference to Nagura sourced from a similar mother stone, or a different stone that maybe has similar properties, but is oftentimes not the original mother stone itself. Or more commonly, you are not going to use a Tomo Nagura and are instead using just a regular Nagura, which is not meant to have the same properties as your primary Whetstone, but instead has been specifically chosen because it has different properties. These properties can vary depending on the Nagura you choose. For instance, they could be softer than your primary Whetstone, meaning when you rub the Nagura on your primary Whetstone surface, the majority of the particles that are being formed within the water, or the slurry as we discussed previously, originate from the Nagura's material and not the Whetstone itself's surface. The alternative is that you have a Nagura which is harder than your primary Whetstone. The resulting slurry formed when rubbing it on your Whetstone will be majority particles from the original Whetstone, not the Nagura itself. Of course, whatever is harder will pull the particles off of the opposite element. Let's take a quick look at what it looks like to use a Nagura to generate a slurry. In this case, it will be a Tomo Nagura, but later in the video, we'll show a full Nagura progression. Earlier, we referenced an alternative type of progression to that of the stone progression. Now that you generally understand what a Nagura is, we can explain the alternative progression, which is called a Nagura progression. This method entails you owning one, usually nice, hard finishing stone, and owning multiple different types of Nagura. These different types of Nagura will have different grits and different hardness values. In such an instance, you would generate different slurries with these Nagura, mimicking a stone progression, moving from a coarse slurry through your Naguras to a fine slurry. In essence, it will create the same type of slurry as you would get from multiple different methods of stones. However, it allows you to invest in one primary hard stone and acquire many different cheaper pieces of Nagura to use in place of total different stones. This method is very popular amongst the razor sharpening enthusiasts. Oftentimes, it is overall cheaper to set up as a progression, but relies heavily upon being able to get appropriate Nagura for your needs, which can be very difficult for an inexperienced user who may not know what they need or may be unable to properly evaluate a Nagura. Now that you understand how to generate slurry and the difference between a stone progression and a Nagura progression, we can now jump into some more complicated topics regarding Japanese natural stones, such as grading, designation, and origin. Generally, we consider there to be three broad categories of Japanese natural stone: coarse, medium, and finishing stones. Within each of these, there's a hardness and fineness rating attributed to each individual stone. This is commonly expressed as a value out of 5, with 1 out of 5 being extremely low on hardness and fineness, and 5 out of 5 being extremely high on hardness and fineness. When you find this rating, it is important to know if you're looking at a coarse, medium, or finishing stone when taking the value into consideration. A coarse stone that is 5 out of 5 in hardness and fineness will only be that hard and that fine relative to other coarse stones. The medium stones will still have the ability to be much harder and much finer than any coarse stone, regardless of how the coarse stone was rated. This remains true as you compare medium stones to finishing stones as well. Each stone category must be evaluated only compared to others within the same category. If you are familiar with synthetic sharpening stones, you will notice a stark contrast between the firm, numerical, designated grit system of the synthetic weight stones compared to the less granular rating of Japanese natural stones. Whereas in synthetic stones, you can count the concentration of injected aluminum oxide particles into the material and claim it to be 1,000 pieces within a certain designation of the material, thus a 1,000 grit stone, natural stones do not have that same ability. This is particularly due to their natural creation, where not only is grit sometimes not evenly distributed within the stone's medium itself, but natural stones also have unique shapes to their abrasive, which drastically alters how it sharpens the blade. In the case of Japanese natural stones, the abrasive material is mixed with the clay-like binder in a platelet format. Later in the video, you will find that I assign analogous grit ratings to natural stone groupings, to help you better understand where each natural stone type fits into a progressively finer stepping process of sharpening or polishing a blade. Though this can be very valuable to the beginner, which is why I do it, breaking yourself off from this idea is imperative as you learn Japanese natural stones more. You really cannot assign individual grits to natural stones. They have a different wear pattern than synthetic stones, and it just does not properly convey the individual qualities the stone may have. It is only really useful in this broad level initial learning step. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Back to our coarse, medium, and finishing stone categories, each has a designated group name in Japanese, which are important to look for when you're identifying the use of the stone and where it falls within all the different spectrums we've talked to till now. These different Japanese designations also correspond to the steps one takes within the sharpening or polishing stone progression, which is useful overlap. I will have future videos breaking down each of these major steps at a later time, but for now I will cover them briefly in an overview format so that you can grasp the meaning of each name designation and begin to understand how the different steps fit together. As discussed before, I will assign analogous synthetic grits to each range for you to have better comprehension of the initial concept. The first group you will start with when sharpening or polishing your blade is the coarsest type of Whetstones we have, which are known as Ara Toishi or Ara-to. They are analogous to synthetic grits within the range of 150 to 800, and will produce when used a very noticeable, audible, and gritty feedback as you slide the blade across the surface. Additionally, if you were to rub your hand across the surface, they will have a very grainy and rough texture about them. For more information on these, check out the Ara Toishi video on this channel, or check the hobbypenguin.com links below, which will cover names of various Ara-to that are available to you in the market, as well as what I estimate their rough individual corresponding grit ranges to be. Let's go ahead and take a look at two different sharpening sessions with different Ara Toishi. The first Ara-to will be coarser, while the second Ara-to will be finer. Pay special attention to the feedback and noise they produce in comparison to the future stones we cover. Once you are done with the Ara-to step, you then move on to the second set of stones that we have, which are what we call our medium weight stones, also known as Naka-to or Naka-to. These are generally analogous to the synthetic grit range of between 1,000 and 5,000. When you use the Naka-to, it will have significantly less audible and tactile feedback than the Ara Toishi steps. However, it will still not be a perfectly smooth or silent process. It will still make a decent amount of noise feedback. As well, if you were to feel it with your hand, it won't feel smooth like glass or smooth in general. It will have some friction to it, but unlike the Ara-to, it will no longer be a sandy or really grainy texture. For more information on these, check out the Naka-to video on the channel, or check the hobbypenguin.com links below, which will cover names of various Naka-to and individual corresponding grit ranges I estimate to be assigned to them. We've actually already seen 2 Naka-to in the video so far, one during the slurry management portion of the video, the second during the self-slurrying stone portion of the video. We'll revisit one of these clips now. Similar to last time, pay special attention to the audio and tactile feedback the stone gives as it is used. The third and last group you will use for blade sharpening or polishing are known as Shiage Toishi, or Awasedo. Most commonly, these are referred to as Awasedo, which is what I will be calling them moving forward. These are analogous to the 5,000 to 16,000 synthetic grit range, and will produce very little audible and tactile feedback when used. When using an Awasedo, you will find that the feedback is fairly frictionless, and that even at the low end of the spectrum, it is very smooth to the hand. This is also the level of stone one needs to use if you wish to utilize a Nagura progression instead of a stone progression. When using a Nagura progression, you would be looking for a very hard and very fine Awasedo, so that it can easily pull the slurry off of the majority of your Nagura, and only at the very end of the progression would you actually want to generate slurry from the stone itself, most commonly again using a diamond Nagura at the very end of the process. Oftentimes, if you are searching for these very hard and fine Awasedo, you should be looking for something in the range of a 5 out of 5, even sometimes a 5+, or often they will just call them razor stones or razor hones. This is because that very fine, very hard nature lends itself very well to the honing process of a straight razor. For more information on Awasedo, check out the channel for our specific Awasedo video, or check the links below for hobbypenguin.com, which will cover various Awasedo information and individual corresponding grit ranges associated with them. Let's go ahead and take a look at 3 different sharpening videos with different Awasedo. The first 2 are actually a form of Suida Awasedo, and the last one is a form of Tomai Awasedo. We will cover what these terms mean after the sharpening videos when we get into stone stratas. Right now, similar to last time, pay attention to the audio and tactile feedback presented compared to the Ara-to and Naka-to steps. Now that we've covered the Ara Toishi, Naka-to, and Awasedo steps, you've seen each part of the stone progression. You can use one stone in each step or multiple stones in each step. It depends on personal preference and the stones that you have available to you. I'd like to also give a demonstration of what a Nagura progression generally looks like. For this demonstration, I will be using a razor and 4 different types of Nagura, which lead from coarse to fine. Then we will move to the Tomo Nagura stage, which in our circumstance we will use a diamond Nagura to generate symbolic slurry for, and finish on water. One of the disbenefits of the Nagura progression is that it can take longer per step, because the actual Whetstone itself is not adding a lot of grinding power, you're relying purely on the slurry. Due to this, I will not show the entire stone sharpening video, but instead just fragments of each of the Nagura steps. At a later date, I will produce a video on how to hone a razor properly, which at that time, if you want to see the whole stone progression, it will be available in video. As you're watching the stone progression, pay close attention to the audio feedback of the different slurries and see if you can tell the difference. Because the Whetstone itself is not changing, it may be much more subtle than the previous examples. The last topics we will cover in this overview today is a brief mention of origin names, strata names, and visual characteristic names for Japanese natural stones. These are important as they are commonly referred to when you're looking at stones online, whether it's listings or another person's collection. Origin name oftentimes refers to the mine that the stone originally came from. Not all stones will have their origin name if it has been lost through multiple transfers of ownership for the individual stone, but the vast majority online will have their origin name identified. When talking about stones, often the origin mine they originated from is the first name you will hear when going to describe the stone. You will usually start with the mine name, move on to the type of stone that it is, the strata it is, and then go into physical characteristics or visual characteristics of the stone. Some of the more common mine names are Nakayama, Ohira, Uzuku, Shubudani, and Iwadani. There are many different mines out there, far more than the 5 I've listed off. If you wish to see a full list of mine names and where they are located within Japan, check out the mines list on hobbypenguin.com or the URL linked in the video description below. Next, when describing a stone, often the strata it originates from will be included in its name. Strata refers to the layer within the earth that the stone was mined out of. This can be an extremely in-depth topic, depending on your interest in geology, but I will try to keep it kind of simple. There are some easy rules to understand when looking at listings of different stones. Ara-to and Naka-to almost never list their strata, as it doesn't matter much to that level of stone, nor how the stone individually performs. The makeup of the stones are not highly compressed in nature, resulting in the strata being relatively irrelevant to the user. The difference is when we look at Awasedo, where the strata level may indicate how the stone will perform. There are many strata levels, but generally you will only hear 4 of them concentrated on, as they are not only the most common strata, but there are many layers within them which do not designate a difference in how they perform. These strata names are Tomai, Aisa, Namito, and Suida. As they were mined within the earth, they sit in that order from shallowest to deepest. Though every natural stone is unique, the strata it originates from may give you some hints as to the common attributes the stone possess. Tomai are the most common stone and the least likely to be highly compressed and hard, though of course there are plenty that are. This layer is also the thickest of all the layers which were mined, and as such, the most Tomai stones are available on the market. Commonly, Tomai stones are lighter in color and do tend to be a little softer. If you see an Awasedo for sale and there's no specific strata given to it, it's a safe bet to assume it is a Tomai stone. The next deepest after Tomai is Aisa, and after Aisa is the strata Namito. These layers tend to be more compressed than Tomai and thus harder and finer, but again, of course, exceptions exist depending on where they were mined from and the geological activity which was put upon them. Aisa and Namito both tend to be darker, harder, and usually finer than Tomai. There are also many times where Aisa and Namito are just called Tomai in the general marketplace. This is obviously incorrect, but as you will find in a lot of Japanese phrasing culture, they will sometimes lump things casually into the same group, less on its origin and more on its nature of use. The last strata we will cover, and the most common talked about besides Tomai, is one called Suida. There are actually many different types of Suida and different layers to Suida, but for now we can just label them all under the same broad category called Suida. What makes these stones unique is not that they are the deepest layer, but instead that during their formation, superheated gas escaped through them. As the gas was escaping from the stone, it left behind little holes where it escaped through. These little holes are referred to as su, which translates to nest or nest plate in Japanese, and can be seen by the naked eye if you look close. These little holes in the stone impact how it ends up sharpening the edge of the blade. Often, you will find that Suida sharpens faster than a similarly hard and fine counterpart from a different strata layer, while still maintaining that hardness and fineness level. This is good, however, it does make for a rather aggressive stone, which lends itself better towards knife sharpening and knife polishing than razor honing. Oftentimes people who hone on Suida will find it too aggressive or too likely to chip because of the holes that are there and the way it impacts how you sharpen on the edge surface. An additional important note is that Suida does not lend itself well to a Nagura progression. The blame for this lies on what makes Suida unique, which are its little holes and the way it was formed. What you may find if you try a Nagura progression with a Suida is that a bit of the initial slurry from your first Nagura can get stuck in those holes, and eventually as you progress through different Nagura, will be dislodged from the Su hole and rejoin your slurry. This can be extremely detrimental when you're trying to get a nice polished edge on something like a razor, where a very hard piece of your original Nagura, which was a very coarse Nagura, comes into the slurry and ruins a lot of the work that you've done to that point. Due to this, Suida in particular lean more towards non-polishing based activities if you're going to use Nagura, so primarily just knife sharpening, or a stone-based progression. The last item we'll talk about today is the different visual characteristics of stones themselves. This will most of the time not impact how the stone actually performs or the feel of the stone on the blade, but we define it nonetheless because it helps us differentiate between different types of stones. There are some common terms you will hear more than others, and these I will cover with you today. For instance, one of the most common terms you will hear is referred to as goma. These are little tiny black dots within the actual sharpening surface of the stone itself. Typically these black dots don't actually mean anything. There are sometimes rumors that it will indicate a fast-cutting stone, but by and large there's never been any evidence of that. It is really just a visual characteristic. The next most common one you will frequently hear is asagi. While the literal translation of asagi is to yellow, it most oftentimes indicates more of a grayish color. At least that is how it is most commonly used for Japanese natural stones nowadays. The last characteristic I will cover today, and one of the most common ones you will find, definitely the most sought after one, is called kita. Kita means yellow plate in Japanese, and obviously that can be a little confusing if asagi means yellow, but when you think of a yellow or cream colored stone, maybe even a little yellow orange, we refer to it as kita. Kita stones are the most sought after stones for a couple of different reasons. People find them to be beautiful stones, but additionally, their slurry is very easy to work with by the way it looks. It's easy to see through, it's easy to see how much you have on the stone itself, and it's also easy to see the amount of swarf coming off of your knife. Swarf is not a term we've covered so far, but it indicates the mixture of micro metal pieces that are being shaved off into the slurry on the top of the stone. You will see your slurry turn gray, and we refer to that gray mixture as swarf. Kita stones make it very easy to monitor your swarf levels and how your knife is cutting. At the end of the day, these are all just visual attributes, and even the kita, while in theory maybe it can help you sharpen a little better, is not actually bringing different or better performance to the table. There are at least a dozen other terms that the Japanese use to indicate different attributes visually for stones. I will not cover them all in this video, and maybe a future video I will cover them. For now, if you wish for more information, check out hobbypenguin.com or the link below to the Whetstone Glossary. This will cover a variety of terms, not just visually, but about different compositions of the stone, as well as the different kanji associated with them, so that maybe you can help identify different stamps on pages or the stone themselves. Well, I think that's enough for today, and where we will wrap up our overview of JNATs, or Japanese natural stones. I will work towards releasing videos in the future breaking down the different steps and progressions we talked about today, as well as highlighting different stones, varieties of stones, as well as their attributes in more concentrated videos. I highly suggest you also check out my website, hobbypenguin.com, where you can find a lot of different information in far greater detail than this regarding to JNATs, Naguras, as well as other natural stones from across the world. And as always, I'm happy to help answer questions regarding your specific needs, either through comments on this video or through my website email. Just let me know and I'll do what I can to help get you on the right track. If you found this video helpful, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so that you can be notified when my next videos come out. Thanks for joining me, and as always, happy sharpening.